It's a chilly, gray afternoon on March 31st, 1922, in Vagen, Bavaria, a small town in the southeast of Germany, only 45 miles or 70 kilometers away from the city of Munich. 46-year-old Maria Baumgartner and her sister, Franziska, are traveling to a small remote farmstead called Hinterkaifeck. The prefix hinter is used in German to describe something that's behind something else. The farmstead was located behind the community of Kaifeck, remote and hidden in a wooden area, so it was referred to as Hinterkaifeck. Maria and her sister are headed to the farm because Maria is to start her new job as a maid for the family that lives there, the Grubers. Maria needed this job. Her parents were dead, she was unmarried, and she had recently lost her previous job as a caretaker for an elderly woman. She had no real home and no income. Her sister Franziska helped her find this job. Rumor had it that the Grubers hadn't been able to replace their last maid, who had quit 7 months ago, and they were desperate for a new one. Maria might have been apprehensive to work for the Grubers because there was a lot of strange gossip surrounding the family. For one, the Grubers were not necessarily well liked in town, because 2 of the family members were arrested for having an incestuous relationship with each other, and one of the children living on the farm might have been a result of that incest. The other rumor that might have unsettled Maria was perhaps the reason why the last maid left. The former maid, Crescence Rieger, had quit at Hinterkaifeck because she no longer felt safe in the house. The patriarch of the Gruber family was known to be quick-tempered and violent, but that wasn't it. You see, Crescence said that the house was haunted. She said that she would hear noises that couldn't be explained from the attic, and always felt like someone was watching her, even when she was alone. Regardless of these rumors, Maria needed this job at Hinterkaifeck, and she was going to have to make it work. The 2 sisters arrived at the farmstead around 5 p.m. that evening and met with the Grubers. Franziska would later say, "The isolation and the loneliness of the farmstead was palpable, but after meeting the Grubers and walking through the house, she felt as though her sister was safe and would have a good job here." There was no way for Franziska to know that she would be the last person to see Maria or the entire Gruber family alive, because just in a few hours, everyone in that house would be brutally murdered with a pickaxe. This is the Hinterkaifeck murders. Hi, strangers. This is your host, Alexa Morrissey, and if you've been a fan of true crime as long as I have, you've probably heard the name Hinterkaifeck. It's a case that's infamous for a reason. Besides the circumstances surrounding the case being creepy, bizarre, and just plain terrifying, the mystery around who could have done this and why still baffles people to this day. And a quick warning, there are several sensitive subjects discussed in this episode today, including violence against children, incest, and sexual abuse, so listener discretion is advised. But if you're still with us, lock your doors and listen closely. This is Stranger in the House. The farm at Hinterkaifeck was built around 1863. According to the Two Queens true crime blog, which did a huge deep dive into this case, the farm had been passed down through the Assam family. And by 1886, Kazilia Assam was named co-owner of the farm, a responsibility she would share with her new husband, Andreas Gruber. Andreas and Kazilia married in April of 1886 and went on to have 2 children, Victoria in 1887 and then Sophie in 1889. Unfortunately, Sophie would die 3 months before her 2nd birthday. In 1892, Andreas and Kazilia would have another child, but she would die later that day. Andreas Gruber was not well liked in the area. He was known to be quick-tempered and just a miserable person in general. There were many rumors that Andreas was abusive towards his wife and children. There was even a rumor that Andreas was having an incestuous relationship with his daughter, Victoria. But regardless of this rumor, Victoria married a man named Carl Gabriel in the spring of 1914. In their marriage contract, Victoria and Carl were named the new owners of Hinterkaifeck. This caused some tension between Andreas and Carl, because Andreas refused to relinquish control of the farm's finances to Carl, despite him being the new official owner. Carl, unfortunately, would never get control of the farm because in the summer of 1914, he would leave to fight in France as World War I had just begun. Carl died 4 months later in December of 1914, making Victoria a widow and leaving her newborn baby girl without a father. Or was her real father still there? The rumors of Victoria and Andreas' ancestral relationship were not really rumors. It had been an open secret in the town that the two of them were having a sexual relationship. This new baby, named Kazilia after her grandmother, was believed by some people to be Andreas' child. In the spring of 1915, an anonymous tip was sent to the authorities about the alleged relationship, and in May of 1915, both Andreas and Victoria were found guilty of incest. Andreas was sentenced to 1 year in prison, and Victoria served a month. Now, obviously, in the year of 2024, we know that Andreas was taking advantage of his daughter, not only because of the power dynamic between them, but by the fact that he was allegedly having sex with her by the age of 16. We know that Victoria was a victim of abuse in this situation, but in 1915 rural Germany, it was illegal for any adult to participate in incest, so they were both punished. Victoria and Andreas served their time, and when they were both released, they resumed their lives back at Hinterkaifeck. In 1916, the Gruber's neighbors, the Schlittenbauers, suffered a great loss. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, who owned the property next to Hinterkaifeck, lost his wife and the mother to his 2 children. After his wife's death, he and the widowed Victoria had an affair. According to Lorenz, Victoria actually, quote, imposed herself on him, and he had no choice but to have sex with her. Multiple times over the course of weeks, mind you. And I think we can safely say that Lorenz may have been fibbing here, but he probably just wanted to distance himself from Victoria, who had quite the reputation at this point. During the affair, Victoria became pregnant and suggested that she and Lorenz get married. Lorenz had children from his first marriage and thought it would be good for him to remarry so that they could have a mother again. When Lorenz went to Andreas to ask for his daughter's hand, it did not go so well. Andreas told Lorenz that even if he married Victoria, he was forbidden from having sex with her. Lorenz was not on board with this agreement, but Victoria said that even if they didn't get married, he still had to accept her baby as his, which he wasn't too keen on because he had a sneaking suspicion that the baby could just as well be Andreas's. Even though both Victoria and Andreas went to prison for the incestuous relationship, there were no signs that they stopped after coming back from prison. The details are fuzzy, but essentially, Andreas and Lorenz get into a heated argument over who is to take responsibility for the child. The fight ends with Lorenz threatening to report Andreas for incest once again, and Andreas responds by chasing Lorenz off the property with a scythe. And if you don't know, a scythe is the very scary weapon that the Grim Reaper is often pictured with. But really, it was just a common tool used on farms at this time to mow grass or harvest crops. Now, just to be clear, we get a lot of this information from Lorenz himself. He talked to police multiple times after the murders occurred, and his story often changed. So we have to take everything he says with a grain of salt. Even after this fight, Victoria demanded that Lorenz pay child support when the new baby was born. And Lorenz responded by reporting the incestuous relationship between Andreas and Victoria to the police. Andreas was once again taken into custody, but was released shortly after because Lorenz withdrew his report. Why? Because according to Lorenz, in exchange for withdrawing his report, Victoria paid him off and told him that he would not have to pay child support as long as he just acknowledged that the baby was his and let her put his name on the baby's birth certificate. It's very possible that Victoria went through all this trouble to make sure that her child was not seen as a product of her incestuous relationship with her father. Whether the baby was or was not is still up for debate. Victoria's son, Joseph, was born in September of 1919. Despite Lorenz allowing his name on the birth certificate, Joseph was raised by the Grubers and didn't have much to do with Lorenz. So, just to recap, the Hinterkaifeck farmstead housed the Gruber family, Casilia and Andreas, who were married, their daughter Victoria, and her 2 children, young Casilia and Joseph. In 1920, the Grubers hired a maid, Crescence Rieger, but she only stayed with the family for a little over a year because unsettling things, yes, more unsettling than the incest, started to happen at the farm. The maid quit in August of 1921, and she told people that she did so because she kept hearing mysterious footsteps in the attic when no one should have been up there. She also said that she always felt like she was being watched by somebody, even when she was alone. She eventually left the Gruber family because she felt unsafe in the house. Now, did she feel unsafe because she believed the house was haunted? Or was it really because Andreas was a violent abuser and may have scared her away? It's unclear, but even after the maid left, the Grubers started reporting strange things happening in their home. In March of 1922, Andreas Gruber found a Munich newspaper on his property. The city of Munich is about 43 miles or 70 kilometers away from Hinterkaifeck. He asked his postman about this, and the postman said that he did not deliver any newspapers from Munich. There were no paperboys in 1920s rural Germany, and no nearby towns sold that paper. That means that someone had to bring that paper from Munich onto the property. And this wasn't a piece of trash that had just tumbled onto their property either. Hinterkaifeck was remote and in the woods and didn't see much through traffic. Soon after that, a key to the farmhouse went missing. According to the Two Queens true crime blog, the same day that the key went missing, Andreas heard footsteps in the attic, just like his former maid. He allegedly investigated the noise, but found nothing suspicious in the attic. Before we go any further, I want to explain the layout of the farmstead to you. It was 2 connected buildings. One was the living quarters for the Gruber family, and the other was the farm building. The 2 buildings are connected to form an L shape. The living quarters had a separate entrance from the farm. The farm building consisted of 4 separate rooms. One was the feeding stalls, one was a barn, and then a barn passage like a small hallway, and then the engine room. All the rooms had separate entrances. On March 29th of that year, the area got a good amount of snow. That night, Andreas went outside to find fresh footprints leading to the engine room entrance. The footprints did not belong to anyone in the family. Andreas went to investigate, and he found that the lock of the engine room had been broken. He also found signs of an attempted break-in on the door to the feeding stalls. But here's the issue. Despite checking the farm building and finding no one, the next day Andreas found that there were never any footprints leaving the farm building, just entering. There was also a report that on that night, Victoria had fled the house and was found crying in the woods by a neighbor. There was an alleged fight that broke out between the family members that evening, but we don't have information on what it could have been about. There is one report from a classmate of young Casilia that Andreas allegedly hit Victoria that night, but that's all we know. This takes us to March 31st, 1922. The Gruber's new maid, Maria, is supposed to arrive that afternoon with her sister. That morning, Andreas and Victoria go into town for some shopping. Both Victoria and Andreas told people that they heard strange noises coming from their attic that night. Andreas also reported that one of their cows had been untied and got loose on the property that night. The two finish their shopping in town and head back home. The new maid Maria and her sister Francisca arrive at Hinterkaifeck around 5 p.m., and after an hour, Francisca leaves. As mentioned earlier, this would be the last time the Grubers and Maria are ever seen alive again. It is not until April 4th, 4 days later, that young Kazilia's teacher realizes that she's once again absent, and alarm bells start to ring. At the same time that the teacher is realizing this, a repairman named Albert Hofner arrives for his scheduled appointment at Hinterkaifeck to repair an engine for Andreas. When no one answers the door to the living quarters, Albert just goes about his business fixing the engine. He heard a dog barking inside the house, but nothing else. He also saw that the barn door was ajar, but he didn't think much of it. On his way to his next job, Albert runs into the Gruber's neighbors, Victoria and Maria Schlittenbauer. Remember Lorenz Schlittenbauer from earlier, who Victoria insisted was the father of her baby? Well, these are his daughters. And Albert tells the girls that the Gruber family did not answer the door and there was no signs of them. Around 3:30 in the afternoon, Victoria and Maria tell their father Lorenz about the situation at Hinterkaifeck. Lorenz sends his two sons, Johann, who was 16, and Joseph, who was 9, to check on the Grubers. And just for clarity, this is not the Joseph he allegedly had with Victoria Gruber. He later remarried, and this Joseph was from that marriage. When the two boys get to Hinterkaifeck, they try and look through the windows of the main house, but they see nothing. They call out for Andreas and Victoria around the property, but they get no response. The boys return home and tell Lorenz that they didn't find any signs of the Grubers. Around 5 p.m., Lorenz and his two sons, as well as two other neighbors, Michael Pohl and Jacob Siegel, head over to Hinterkaifeck. The men make their way to the main buildings, but interestingly, Lorenz does not go for the front door like everyone else. He leads the group towards the barn, and when they enter, they see that the stable door connecting the feeding stalls and the barn had been knocked down, and from under the door, they see a foot sticking out. Jacob and Michael both say they should leave everything as it is and get the authorities, but Lorenz lifts the door up and reveals 3 bodies stacked on top of one another. Covered in bloody wounds were the bodies of Andreas, his wife Kazilia, and Victoria, lying on top of one another. It was clear that they had all been bludgeoned to death. Lorenz moves the bodies off of each other and drags them into the feeding stall to lay them out. As he is laying the bodies down, the men notice something else in the hay nearby. It was Victoria's daughter, 7-year-old Kazilia, who was also apparently bludgeoned to death. It's at this point that Lorenz sends his older son to go get the authorities. At first, Lorenz, Michael, and Jacob decide to wait outside for the authorities. But Lorenz suddenly changes his mind and declares that he has to go see if, quote, his boy is still alive. His boy is referring to Joseph, whom Victoria alleged was his son, and he had fought so hard to have nothing to do with. Lorenz enters the house through the stable somehow, while Michael and Jacob wait by the front door. According to the two men, they hear Lorenz walk to the front door and unlock it with a key. Remember, there is only one key left to the house, because one went missing earlier that month. Did Lorenz just happen to find the one key left out in the open, or did he perhaps have the missing key? We're definitely going to get back to that. But for now, the 3 men enter the farmhouse and look for little Joseph. Lorenz immediately leads them to Victoria's room that she shared with Kazilia and Joseph. Horribly, baby Joseph is found dead in his bassinet. After seeing this, Lorenz left the room right away and said he needed to light a candle for his son. Jacob and Michael continue to walk around the house, and that's when they discover Maria, the new maid, lying in her room, also bludgeoned to death. After that, the men go into Andreas and older Kazilia's room and see that nothing looks out of place. They walk out of the house, and Lorenz says that they need to feed the animals while they wait for the police. Strangely, though, the men observe that none of the animals on the farm seem hungry. And from the troughs, it appears that they had been recently fed, despite everyone who lived on the farm being dead for several days. Michael and Jacob continued to tell Lorenz that the animals don't need food and that he really needs to stop touching things at the crime scene. But he doesn't listen to them. And really, it didn't matter if Lorenz kept touching things, though, because soon enough, more and more townspeople would arrive at the farm and trample through the crime scene before police arrived. People from the town allegedly moved furniture, cooked, and even ate meals in the house, all while the bodies were still there. This is long before DNA, so no one probably knew better. But also remember that the Grubers were kind of the town pariahs. They were this weird incestuous family that no one really liked, so I doubt the townspeople treated the scene with too much respect, and instead treated it more like a freak show. When the authorities finally arrive, they need to call in some assistance from the Munich police, because this was a bigger case than they had ever handled. The coroner was a man named Dr. Johann Aumüller, and according to the Two Queens blog, he conducted the autopsies out in the open courtyard of the farmhouse. Aumüller determined that all 6 victims were bludgeoned to death by probably more than one weapon. He named a cross axe, a hoe, and a mattock that was found at the scene as possible weapons. And if you didn't know, because I didn't, a mattock is similar to a pickaxe. And let's talk about this mattock for a second, because it's a little odd. The weapon had a long flat blade on top of a wooden handle, and it was used for removing weeds. There was a protruding screw right underneath the opposite side of the blade, on the handle. So think 2 points at the top of this wooden handle, 1 blade and 1 screw. This protruding screw on the handle was allegedly used for killing pigs on the farm. According to one source on hinterkaifeck.ch, Andreas had added the screw to the mattock, so this wasn't a common thing for the weapon to have. But according to the medical examiner, there were many injuries on the victims that suggested the killer had used the screw on the handle to make small, precise wounds on the victims, something they would only know how to do if they were familiar with Andreas's invention. Now, this source also mentions that the mattock belonged to Lorenz Schlittenbauer first, and Andreas stole it from him. But that was only in one source, so I'm not sure if that's true or not. Now let's talk about the state the bodies were found in. Andreas Gruber was found in his sleeping clothes, and because his bed was undisturbed, it was assumed that he was getting ready for bed when he was murdered. He had extensive wounds to his head and face. His wife, Kazilia, was in her everyday clothes, and she had 7 obvious blows to the head. Her skull was shattered. Victoria was also wearing her everyday clothes, but she was barefoot. Victoria seemed to have the most brutal death. She allegedly had strangulation marks on her neck, as well as 9 axe wounds on her head. Her skull was also shattered. Her daughter, Kazilia, was wearing her nightgown. She also had extensive axe wounds to her head and neck, but it seemed as though she lived for a while after her attack, as tufts of her own hair were found in her fists. Experts believe that after being attacked and seeing her family dead, Kazilia started to rip out her own hair in distress, or did it to distract herself from the pain elsewhere. Joseph, the baby, was also in a nightgown and was killed by 1 single blow to the head. Maria, the maid, was found in her everyday clothes and still had her shoes on. She had a single wound to the right side of her head. Now, police believed that there was no way one person could overpower 3 adults on their own, all at once, and that none of them would escape while this attack was happening. So how did Victoria, both Kazilias, and Andreas end up murdered in the barn? Police believed that each person was somehow lured to the barn one by one. Kazilia Sr. or Victoria was killed in the barn first, as they were not dressed for bed. It was assumed that one of them was killed earlier in the evening of March 30th. When one of them didn't return, the other went looking for her, only to be attacked as well. Andreas was most likely in the house, getting ready for bed, when he realized that his wife and daughter had still not returned from the barn. He went looking for the 2 women and was killed as well. This would explain why Andreas was at the top of the stack of bodies. After all the adults in her family did not return from the barn, it is likely that young Kazilia went looking for them as well, suffering the same fate that they did. Maria the maid, who just arrived a couple hours earlier, probably didn't know much about the property yet, and didn't go looking for the family. When she didn't come into the barn, the killer perhaps made their way into the house to murder her. We can't be certain who died first, but after the killer entered the house, Joseph was killed in his bassinet. That's the rough order of events that can be inferred from how the bodies were found. But let's get into the evidence that was found at the crime scene. A robbery was quickly ruled out because valuables and large amounts of money were found all over the house. There was, however, a substantial amount of evidence that suggested that someone had been living in the barn after the murders, and perhaps even long before. A secure rope was hanging from the top of one of the barn beams. If one were to climb the rope, they would gain access to a small door to the attic of the living quarters. There were also handprints on the dust on the beam near this access point. Human blood and hair were found on the floor of the attic, and the roof of the attic had a couple of tiles removed. When you look through this hole in the roof, you were able to see a clear view of the courtyard, meaning that if someone was in the attic, looking through this hole, they could see anyone who came and went from the farmstead. Remember the maid who quit because she thought the house was haunted and she could hear unexplained footsteps? Well, there was a good chance that she was actually hearing someone sneak around the Gruber's attic. And if this was what she was hearing, that meant that the killer had access to the house months before the murders and was watching the family. There were 2 indentations in the hay in the barn that suggested that someone or multiple people had been sleeping there. Human excrement was also found in a hay pit, which suggests that someone had been there for a while. One witness came forward and said that the day or so after the family was allegedly murdered, but not discovered, he saw a light on in the kitchen, and there was smoke coming from the fireplace. From the state of the kitchen, it seemed that someone had been cooking recently. Remember, Victoria and Andreas went shopping the morning they were murdered, but from the state of the pantry, it seemed like a lot of bread and meat were missing, more than the family could eat in those couple of hours between shopping and being murdered. There was also a pot of fresh soup on the stove when the bodies were first discovered. This meant that the murderer was cooking and eating in the house, and most likely taking care of the animals on the farm, with the dead bodies in the other room for at least 2 days. The Munich police couldn't gather much more evidence from the house that pointed to any one suspect, as the crime scene was so compromised by Lorenz moving the bodies and the townspeople coming and going in the house. Desperate to find the killer, the Munich police even removed the heads of all 6 victims and sent them to several clairvoyants in hopes that they could use some sort of psychic power to gain insights into the murderer. Sadly, the heads were never returned to the victims' final resting places because they were lost in the destruction of World War II. This is where I tell you that unfortunately, the Hinterkaifeck murders remain unsolved to this day. With the compromised crime scene and various records and pieces of evidence eventually lost in World War II, it's most likely that we will never have an answer to who committed these horrendous murders. But there are some theories about who did it. There were several suspects that the police initially looked at. A mentally ill man named Joseph Bartel, who was known to be dangerous in the town, 2 brothers that were known robbers in the area, even Victoria's dead husband, who never returned from fighting in World War I, was somehow a suspect at one point. But the most believable suspect, in my opinion, is Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Let's walk through what we know about Lorenz. We know that he and Victoria had an affair that ended with her demanding he acknowledge her son as his, something that he did not want to do. He and Andreas got into a heated argument over this matter, and Lorenz was chased off the property by Andreas with a scythe. We know that Lorenz reported Andreas and Victoria for their incestuous relationship before retracting his report after Victoria paid him off. Now let's talk about his behavior at the crime scene. Remember, Lorenz immediately went to check the barn when he arrived, not the front door of the living quarters like everyone else had. He found the bodies right away when no one else had. He then moved the bodies despite the other 2 men telling him not to. He then knew how to enter the house through the stables, and the 2 men with him allegedly heard him use a key to unlock the front door. Lorenz also led them through the house to find Joseph with confidence, like he knew the layout of the house. After discovering the bodies, he then goes around making sure the animals have been fed, which is something we know the murderer did after the family was killed. But I also want to point out that if he was truly upset about the loss of baby Joseph, despite him not being a part of his life, he could have just been in shock. Because I want you to remember that people do strange things when they are grieving. Aside from all this, there are 2 things I haven't told you about Lorenz. One, on March 30th, the day before the murders, Lorenz and his wife had to bury their baby girl, Anna. She was only 4 weeks old when she died from whooping cough. The family was obviously devastated. Alone, this seemingly doesn't suggest anything about a motive to kill the Grubers. But when you considered the issues he had with little Joseph's paternity, and Victoria and Andreas's relationship, it's possible that his daughter's death could have been a tipping point for Lorenz, and he took his anger and grief out on the Grubers. I personally don't know if this theory has any merit on its own, but in combination with the second thing I haven't told you about Lorenz, it might. Now, just to be clear, this is a rumor, but it was said that before the murders, Victoria traveled to a nearby town to legally claim money from Lorenz in child support, and this was allegedly because of the current economic crisis in Germany. And just as a historical side note, this murder took place in 1922. World War I had just ended, and Germany was not in a good place financially. Germany was forced to pay legal sanctions after the war, and hyperinflation was causing millions of Germans to fall into poverty. When you think about this, it's a little odd that no money was taken from the house, considering the state of the country. Remember, huge sums were found all over the house. But Lorenz might not have needed their money. He just might not have wanted to pay the Grubers for a child that may or may not be his, especially after losing his baby girl. Now, is this enough motive for such a brutal murder? We will probably never know. It's very possible that whoever killed the Grubers wasn't Lorenz, wasn't any of the suspects that the police looked at, and was just a stranger living in their barn. But what we do know is this: the Grubers were most likely completely unaware that they were living with a stranger in their house for almost a year. Someone who watched them, walked around in their attic, and slept in their barn, and continued to do so even after they murdered them. Stay safe, strangers, and thanks for listening. This episode was written by Alexa Morrissey. Stranger in the House is a Boy Wonder production. All of our sources and links to pictures of the farmhouse can be found in the show notes.